My name is Donna Parker, and I am 44 years old. For most of my life, I have learned how to make myself smaller, not physically, because that was never really an option for me, but emotionally, quietly, in ways that wouldn't draw attention or invite criticism. I didn't always realize I was doing it. It felt natural, like breathing, like survival, especially when it came to my husband's parents. If you asked anyone on the outside, they'd probably say my life looked fine. I had been married for 16 years to a man I once believed was my safest place in the world. We had twin daughters, who were 13 now, bright loud when they forgot to be careful, and still sweet in ways only kids on the edge of adolescence can be. Our home was usually warm, full of noise routines, small arguments that didn't matter, and laughter that did. For a long time, I thought that was enough. The only shadow hanging over all of it had always been my in-laws. We hadn't spoken to them in 7 years. 7 whole years of silence so complete that sometimes it almost felt like they were fictional characters from another life. My husband's parents were both in their early 60s now, but even thinking of them made my stomach tighten the way it used to when I was younger. They were without exaggeration the cruelest people I had ever known, and they hated me, openly at first, then quietly, then strategically. Their problem with me was never subtle, even when they pretended it was. I have always been a big woman, big-boned, broad-shouldered, the kind of body that fills space whether you want it to or not. I grew up with it, made peace with it, worked hard to stay healthy, strong, capable. I go to the gym. I take care of myself. I can do everything anyone else can do. But none of that mattered to them. To my in-laws, my body was a flaw that needed constant commentary. When my husband and I were dating, every dinner at their house came with a side of humiliation. Comments about portions, about watching my health, about how certain outfits weren't flattering. At first, they said it outright. When I finally told my husband how much it hurt, he confronted them, and they stopped at least verbally. Instead, they became creative. They'd serve bland food in child-sized portions and smile while explaining they were watching what they ate, even though they were barely in their 40s at the time. They'd glance at my plate, count bites, notice everything. They never said my name without attaching judgment to it. And it wasn't just my body. They didn't like that my parents were cattle farmers from Minnesota. They didn't like my accent, my laugh, the way I got excited when I talked. My mother-in-law used to put a finger to her ear when I laughed too loudly, her lips pinched in faux concern, as if I were physically hurting her. So I learned. I learned to speak softer, to laugh less, to sit straighter, to swallow my discomfort and tell myself I was being sensitive. My husband apologized constantly, but apologies don't undo damage when the damage keeps happening. After we got married, things didn't improve. If anything, they sharpened. When I got pregnant with the twins, they treated my body like public property. I was huge, they said, as if I didn't already know. After the girls were born, the focus shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't just me under the microscope, it was my daughters too. They were chubby babies like most babies are, but as they grew, it became clear they were built like me. Healthy, strong, big-boned. My grandmother had been the same way. My mother too. I expected it. My husband did as well. His parents, however, seemed personally offended. By the time the girls were 5 or 6, the comments started. They told them they'd grow up to be fat monsters if they didn't stop eating. They glared at them when they laughed too loudly, training them to shrink just like I had learned to do. I watched my daughters hesitate before taking seconds. I watched joy leave rooms they walked into, and something in me broke. I gave my husband an ultimatum then. He could choose his parents, or he could choose me and the kids. There was no third option anymore. He finally confronted them. Really confronted them, and the fight that followed was ugly enough to end everything. We walked away. 7 years of silence followed, and for the first time my children felt safe. Or so I thought. 3 days ago, on New Year's Eve, my husband told us he had a surprise planned. A great new place, he said. Something special. He wouldn't say more. The girls were excited. I was too, in a cautious way. We dressed up. We laughed. We got into the car as the sky darkened and the streets filled with anticipation. Then I recognized the route. Even after 7 years, even after moving some roads, never leave your memory. My chest tightened as realization hit me. I told him to pull over. He did. The girls stayed in the car while I tore into him on the side of the road, my voice shaking with betrayal. That's when he told me about the apology. about his mother's stage 3 liver cancer, about how she wanted to make things right before it was too late. He was crying. He showed me the messages. They sounded desperate, afraid. He said if I didn't want to go, we didn't have to, but he wanted me to think about it. When they called, they begged. For the first time, they begged me. I felt guilty. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Looking back now, that was the moment everything started falling apart. The rest of the drive passed in a strange, strained quiet. After I agreed, my husband exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for days. He reached for my hand, tentative, almost afraid I'd pull away. I let him hold it mostly because I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. The girls sat in the back seat whispering to each other, glancing up every so often, as if they could sense the shift in the air. When I finally turned around and asked them how they felt about seeing their grandparents, there was a pause that felt heavier than any argument. I told them the truth that their grandmother was sick, that she might not have much time left, and that it was their choice. We could turn around, we could go home, we could pretend this night never happened. After a few minutes of hushed discussion between them, they nodded, hesitant but willing. That should have reassured me. Instead, it filled me with dread. As we pulled into my in-laws' driveway, a familiar unease settled deep in my bones. The house looked exactly the same. Same pale exterior, same neatly trimmed hedges, same windows that always felt like they were watching. My husband's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years, his eyes shining with something dangerously close to relief. He rushed out of the car before any of us could follow, calling out for his parents like a child returning home after a long absence. The reunion was emotional. Hugs that lingered too long. Tears. Soft murmurs I couldn't hear. I stood back with my daughters, my hands resting on their shoulders, grounding myself in their warmth. When I finally looked at my mother-in-law closely, my unease sharpened. She didn't look sick, not fragile, not gaunt. Her skin was clear, her posture strong, her hair thick and neatly styled. No scarf, no wig, no visible signs of months of chemotherapy. I told myself not everyone looks the same when they're ill. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, the doubt took root. When they finally turned their attention to us, their expressions shifted. The warmth they showed their son didn't reach their eyes when they looked at me or at the girls. There were smiles, yes, but tight ones. Smirks, almost. Something about it made my stomach drop. I ignored it the way I always had. I didn't want to be the difficult one, not tonight. Inside, nothing had changed. The furniture was exactly where I remembered it. Even the faint smell of the house polish and something stale underneath pulled me back. Years in an instant. For hours they talked to my husband as if we weren't there. Stories from his childhood, neighbors we didn't know, complaints about doctors and bills, and how hard everything had been. My daughters and I sat quietly exchanging looks, making ourselves invisible, because experience had taught us that being noticed rarely ended well. Around 11:30, just when I was counting down the minutes until we could politely leave, my mother-in-law suddenly clapped her hands together and announced that she had something special for the girls. Her voice was syrupy sweet in a way that made my skin crawl. For a moment, just a moment, I let myself believe this might be different, that maybe illness had softened them, that maybe 7 years had changed something. They brought out a box, neatly wrapped square and solid. The girls unwrapped it carefully, their excitement tentative but real, and then the paper fell away. The silence that followed was deafening. Inside the box was a weighing scale. I felt something inside me snap. My daughters' faces felt instantly confusion, flashing across their eyes before shame took its place. I didn't remember standing up, but suddenly I was screaming. Years of swallowed anger poured out of me all at once. I don't even remember everything I said, only the sound of my own voice, raw and furious, filling the room. My husband looked stunned, frozen between us, until finally something seemed to click. We didn't stay long after that. We stormed out before midnight, before the new year could even begin. My husband didn't wait for explanations. He didn't look back. And as we drove away, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror, I knew this wasn't just about a gift. It was about everything. The drive home felt endless, even though it was the same stretch of road we'd taken countless times before. The city lights blurred past the windows, fireworks already beginning to crackle in the distance as people welcomed the new year. Inside our car, there was no celebration, only the heavy silence that follows something irreparably broken. At first, I was shaking too hard to speak. My hands were clenched in my lap. nails biting into my skin, my chest tight with a mix of rage and humiliation. The girls sat in the back seat, unnaturally quiet. I kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror, watching them stare out the windows, their reflections pale and distant. They didn't cry. Somehow that hurt more. My husband was the first to break the silence. He kept saying he was sorry, over and over again, that he didn't know, that he never imagined his parents would do something like that. Each apology landed wrong, like it was aimed at the situation rather than at us. Something ugly and sharp rose in my throat, and before I could stop myself, it spilled out. I told him he had lied to me, that he had manipulated me into bringing our children back into a house we'd escaped for a reason. I told him how humiliating it was to sit there for hours while his parents ignored us, how small and exposed I'd felt watching our daughters shrink under their gaze. I reminded him that this wasn't new, that this was who they had always been. He defended himself at first. He said he'd cut them off for 7 years, that he'd chosen us once before, that the cancer had scared him, that it had felt cruel not to give them another chance. I snapped back that his parents had been cruel long before they ever claimed to be sick, and that even now they hadn't changed at all. If anything, they'd just gotten better at hiding it. By the time we pulled into our driveway, my voice was hoarse and my head was pounding. Midnight passed unnoticed. The new year came and went while we sat in the car, fractured and exhausted. We got the girls inside, helped them get ready for bed, spoke softly like everything was normal. As soon as their bedroom doors closed, the tension exploded again. That was when I said the thing I'd been thinking for years, but had never dared to say out loud, that he had never truly protected us, that he had let his parents hurt me, then our children, for far too long before he finally stepped in. That even now he had chosen to believe them over his own instincts, over mine, over our daughter's safety. He looked at me like I'd slapped him. He told me that wasn't fair, that I didn't understand how hard it was to walk away from your parents, that loving them didn't mean he loved us any less. I told him that love without action didn't mean anything to me anymore, that intentions didn't undo damage, that I was tired of being patient, tired of swallowing my pain so everyone else could stay comfortable. The argument went in circles, growing louder, sharper, until I felt completely emptied out. At some point, I realized I wasn't fighting to be understood anymore. I was fighting because I didn't know how to stop. When it finally ended, nothing was resolved. We slept in the same house that night, but miles apart. And as I lay awake, listening to the quiet, one thought kept looping in my mind, steady and terrifying in its clarity. This wasn't just a fight. This was the beginning of the end. The days that followed blurred together in a way that made time feel unreliable. We moved around each other carefully, like strangers sharing a space out of obligation rather than love. Mornings became quiet rituals stripped of warmth. No lingering glances, no casual touches, just the mechanics of getting through the day for the sake of the girls. I told myself the silence was temporary, that once emotions cooled, we would talk like we always had. But something fundamental had shifted. I could feel it every time he spoke to me with forced politeness, every time he avoided my eyes. It was as if the argument in the car hadn't ended, it had simply gone underground, burrowing deeper, poisoning things slowly. A week passed like that. The girls had a sleepover at a friend's house one night, and for the first time in days, the house was empty, except for the two of us. I thought maybe that was the opening we needed. Space, privacy, a chance to reset. When he asked if we could talk, I felt a flicker of relief. I said yes, already rehearsing what I hoped would be an apology, an acknowledgement, something. Instead, he told me he was still hurt. He said my words in the car had cut him deeply, that accusing him of choosing his parents over his family was unfair after everything he'd done, after cutting them off for 7 years, after walking out with us on New Year's Eve. He said he felt like no matter what he did, it would never be enough for me. I listened exhausted, my body heavy with a tiredness that sleep never seemed to touch. I told him it was the bare minimum, that doing the right thing once didn't erase years of hesitation, years where I'd carried the emotional burden alone, years where our daughters learned what it felt like to be watched, judged, corrected for existing. He said I was asking him to do the impossible, that if I were in his place, I would have struggled too. That was when something in me hardened. I told him if it had been my parents, there wouldn't have been a struggle, not for a second, that I would have cut them off the moment they harmed the people I loved, that my loyalty had always been clear. He said it was easy for me to say because my parents weren't like his, and he was right, but not in the way he thought. My parents weren't like his because they were decent, because they didn't bully children, because they didn't mistake cruelty for concern. The argument escalated quickly after that. Voices rose, old grievances resurfaced. He accused me of being too sensitive. I accused him of dismissing me. At some point, he snapped at me while I was on the phone with a friend demanding my attention like I owed it to him. Something about the way he spoke, sharp, impatient, entitled "hit a nerve I didn't know" was still exposed. I told him to watch his tone, told him I wasn't his doormat anymore. Not his, not anyone's. The words surprised both of us. He stared at me like he didn't recognize the woman standing in front of him. Maybe he didn't. Maybe I didn't either. The fight spiraled from there, losing any connection to its original cause. By the time he stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him, I felt hollow instead of angry. That night, I tucked my daughters into bed alone. Their voices were softer than usual, their questions carefully chosen. I answered what I could and left the rest unsaid. Afterward, I sat in the dark living room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the house. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about how to fix things. I was thinking about how long I'd been breaking myself to keep them together, and whether there was anything left to save. 2 weeks passed after that night, and the house adjusted to my husband's absence with unsettling ease. His things were still here. His shoes by the door, his coffee mug in the cabinet, his jacket hanging where he'd left it, but his presence was reduced to a silence that felt intentional. He stayed with a friend, sending short, practical texts about the girls' schedules, about work, about things that didn't require emotion. I answered in the same clipped tone. It was easier that way. Safer. What surprised me most was the calm that crept in beneath the sadness. Without the constant tension, without bracing myself for the next argument or disappointment, I could breathe again. I still hurt, of course. There were moments when grief hit me out of nowhere, folding laundry and realizing half of it was his hearing, a song that used to be ours, waking up in the middle of the night, reaching for someone who wasn't there. But alongside that grief was something quieter and steadier. Clarity. When we finally agreed to meet, it was at a small coffee shop halfway between our workplaces. Neutral ground. No memories attached. He looked tired when I saw him, older somehow, like the past few weeks had taken something from both of us. We sat across from each other, hands wrapped around warm cups we barely touched. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then slowly we did. Not like before. There was no shouting, no defensiveness, no urgency to win. We talked like two people standing at the edge of something already decided. He admitted he'd been afraid of becoming the man who abandoned his parents, afraid of regret, afraid of living with guilt. I told him I'd been afraid too, afraid of being alone, afraid of failing, afraid of admitting that love wasn't enough anymore. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, the truth settled between us like a fact neither of us could deny. Our marriage hadn't broken on New Year's Eve. It had been eroding quietly for years, worn down by unresolved pain and the constant imbalance of whose feelings mattered more. We had both been holding on to a version of us that no longer existed. When the word separation finally surfaced, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. We talked about logistics, about co-parenting, about schedules and school pickups and holidays, about doing this without bitterness, without dragging the girls through a war they didn't ask for. When we told them a few days later, I braced myself for tears, for anger, for questions I wouldn't know how to answer. Instead, they listened quietly. One of them asked if we were still their parents. The other asked if they'd still see both of us. When we said yes, they nodded. That was it. That night, after they went to bed, I stood alone in the kitchen and cried. Not because it was over, but because I finally understood how long I had been surviving instead of living. I mourned the marriage I thought I had, the woman I used to be, the version of myself who believed endurance was the same as strength. But beneath the grief was something else, relief, resolve, a sense that choosing myself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. I didn't know what the future would look like. I only knew that for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't shrinking anymore. The morning after everything was decided, the house felt different. Not lighter exactly, just quieter in a way that didn't press down on my chest. I woke up before the alarm and lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the slow, ordinary sounds of the neighborhood coming to life. Cars starting. A dog barking. Someone's sprinklers clicking on. Life continuing indifferent to the fact that mine had shifted onto a new axis. I moved through the day, slowly, deliberately. I made breakfast for the girls, packed lunches, asked about school the way I always had. They watched me closely at first, like they were waiting for me to crack, but when I didn't, they relaxed. That told me more than words ever could. They didn't need perfection. They needed steadiness. They needed honesty. They needed to see that endings didn't have to mean destruction. Later, when the house was empty, I sat down on the couch, the same spot where I'd fallen asleep weeks earlier, exhausted and numb, and let myself really think about what came next. Not just logistically, but emotionally. For so long, every decision I'd made had been filtered through other people's comfort. My husband's guilt, my parents' opinions, my children's reactions, even my in-laws' cruelty had shaped me more than I'd ever admitted. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped asking what I wanted and started asking what would keep everyone else from being upset. That version of me felt very far away now. I won't pretend this ending was clean or painless. There are days when loneliness creeps in unexpectedly, when I miss the familiarity of being married, the ease of sharing history with someone who knows all your stories. There are moments when I second-guess myself, when guilt whispers that maybe I should have tried harder, been quieter, been more patient, made myself smaller one last time. But then I remember the look on my daughter's faces when that gift was unwrapped. I remember how it felt to sit in that house, invisible, knowing I had brought them back into harm because I chose politeness over instinct. And I remember the sound of my own voice when I finally said I wasn't a doormat anymore. That matters. I don't know what my future looks like yet. I don't know if love will find me again, or if I even want it to right now. What I do know is that I'm learning how to take up space emotionally, mentally, unapologetically. I'm learning that peace doesn't come from keeping everyone happy. It comes from being honest, even when that honesty changes everything. This chapter of my life didn't end the way I once imagined, but for the first time in years, it feels like the ending belongs to me. And that finally feels like enough.